So many amazing things happened in season 4 of The Chosen that it can be hard to remember them all. But even more important than that, there are deeper meanings hidden within each of these episodes that most people didn't even notice. Like the real reason John the Baptist is killed, or what truly drives Quintus to kill Ramah, or the hidden meaning behind Jesus' tears as he looks upon the olive press. Each of these insights will change the way you see season 4 and open your eyes to things you've never seen before in the Bible. So if you're interested to learn all about this, then join me for this episode of The Chosen Explained. But first, if you love learning insights about The Chosen and want to see connections between the show and the Bible that will transform the way you watch it, then click the link above and down in the description and download my free resource called 7 Biblical Secrets Hidden in The Chosen. This will show you connections to Scripture and the first century world of Jesus that are present in the show, but most people don't notice. We've packed a whole lot of information into a really small package, just like this video. Speaking of, let's dive in. Episode 1 depicts an important moment in the Gospels that describes the death of John the Baptist at the hands of Herod Antipas. Antipas orders John to be beheaded at the request of the daughter of his wife Herodias after she pleases him with a dance. But the reason behind John's death goes far beyond an irresponsible promise and a mother's conspiracy. John's death is connected to Jesus himself. You see, what's interesting about Herod Antipas is that his power didn't extend very broadly. He wasn't the king of all Israel. He wasn't even a king of Jerusalem. In fact, he wasn't even really a king at all. The more accurate description of this Herod is the title that we find in Matthew and Luke's Gospels, Tetrarch. And this is because when his father, Herod the Great, died, the same Herod who ordered all of the young males to be killed when Jesus was born, when he died, his lands were redistributed by Rome. In some of the land, Rome actually installed their own governors, and in other parts, they gave them to Herod's sons. Antipas was in charge of the regions of Galilee and Perea. And since Galilee is where most of Jesus' ministry occurs, this is why we see Herod Antipas so prominently in the Gospels. This fact also gives us context for the conflict between Herod and John. John performed his ministry along the Jordan. He too crossed into Herod's territory. And in a passage from Mark's Gospel, we learn of the events that will ultimately lead to John's death. John is upset because Herod is marrying a woman named Herodias. But the real question is, why does this upset him so much? And the answer to that is actually fairly complex. You see, when Herod decides to marry Herodias, he's actually already married. And so is Herodias. Herodias is the wife of his brother Philip, who is also a tetrarch. So for Herod to marry Herodias, not only must he divorce his wife, and not only must Herodias leave her husband, causing both of them to commit adultery. Additionally, Herodias is his niece, the daughter of his brother Aristobulus. And then finally, this betrayal is ultimately going to lead to armed conflict between Herod's armies and the armies of his former wife's father, Aretas, costing innocent people their lives. This is a moral disaster on many levels. It will harm people far beyond those involved. It highlights the immorality of those in power, those leading this nation. And ultimately, it's something John will forfeit his life to resist. But here's the thing. That's the story on the surface. But then there's also the deeper meaning here, the subtle narrative that impacts Jesus, the real reason that John is killed, and that Jesus should watch out for his own life. You see, just before Mark tells us this story about Herod, he tells us about some rumors spreading about Jesus. People are asking the question, who is this man really? And several ideas are floated. Some say that one of the prophets has come back, others say that John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and some say Elijah, just like they said about John. But there's more to this rumor about Jesus than simply thinking a prophet has returned. This is meant to show us how Jesus was viewed by the people around him. And more importantly, this is meant to indicate how Jesus was viewed by Herod and others in positions of power. Jesus was a threat, one claiming to be the rightful king to the throne of Israel, and one who was no friend of Herod and the religious leaders. In fact, one of Jesus' most powerful condemnations against the religious leaders is when he says, "Woe to you, because you build tombs for the prophets, and it was your ancestors who killed them." And who were these religious leaders that Jesus is condemning, conspiring with in Mark's Gospel just a few chapters ago? The Herodians. You see, the last time there was even a reference to Herod's name was when the religious leaders and the Herodians were plotting together to kill Jesus. And then when you add to this the fact that the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that Herod executed John not just because of the situation with Herodias, but because John had become too popular, well, what becomes clear is that John was a threat, and so is Jesus. You see, at the time, people believed that the Messiah was going to be a great warrior king who would kick people like Herod out of Israel and return the land to God's people. Herod the Great wanted to put an end to Jesus' life for this very reason when Jesus was born. And when we look closer at Scripture, we can see that his son eventually does too. Ever since the campfire scene in season 2, we've known that there was incredible tension between Peter and Matthew. In fact, you could probably even call it hatred. Matthew had worked for Rome as a tax collector and was just a day away from calling all of Peter's debts in and stripping his family from everything they had. In episode 2 of season 4, after all this time, Matthew has finally apologized to Peter. But Peter isn't ready to accept it. And when Peter comes to Jesus about it, Jesus tells him to forgive Matthew not just 7 times for 7 of the terrible things Matthew did to him, but to forgive him 77 times or 70 times 7 times. Now, this is one of those moments where it's really great to look up the scripture that The Chosen uses for this scene and to explore what else is going on in that particular passage. Because while the show did not quote everything else that happens after Jesus says these words, it definitely seems to have used them. You see, in Matthew 18, after Jesus tells Peter to forgive 77 times, meaning limitless forgiveness, he tells a parable. He says, "For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man, a king, who wanted to settle accounts with his slaves. And when he began to settle them, someone was brought to him who owed 10,000 talents." Now, to Jesus' audience, this is an insane amount of debt. 10,000 talents is the equivalent to roughly 150,000 years worth of wages. It is impossible to overcome. Which, of course, naturally makes us think, who else had a debt that seemed impossible to overcome? Peter. There was no way he was going to cover his tax debt. Even though he didn't deserve it, Jesus saved him from this huge debt, which makes what happens next in the parable even more interesting. Because in the parable, the king has mercy on this slave. He frees him from this debt. But then the slave does something awful. He finds someone who is indebted to him, and he shows no mercy, no grace, none of the goodness that he himself just received. Which is exactly what Peter's doing to Matthew. Matthew owes Peter a great debt. He did him terrible harm, and honestly, there is nothing that Matthew can do to repay that. Nothing he can do to ever make up for all of the harm he caused Peter and his family. And what Jesus is saying is, he doesn't have to. None of us has to. That's the beauty of grace. It can't be earned. It can't be deserved. It is God's gift to us, God's gift to Peter. And it's the gift that Peter needs to give to Matthew. But here's why this incorporation of this parable is so important. Because it reminds us that as these events are unfolding on screen, this is part of a bigger message that Jesus is speaking to all of us. The reminder that we each need to be forgiven, that we each have people in our own lives that we need to forgive. And that just as Jesus reminded Peter of the grace he had received, he's reminding us that we too have received the gift that we can never deserve. And as his disciples, he's calling upon us to offer the same gift to others. Throughout episode 3, Quintus has been growing more and more furious. And this is actually because of hundreds of years worth of events that have led up to this moment. Just a few centuries before the time of Jesus, a different group was in control of the Holy Land, the Seleucids. The Seleucids despised the Jews. They tried to eradicate Jewish culture and replace it with Greek culture. They banned most Jewish practices and forced Greek customs. In fact, many Jewish practices were labeled capital crimes, and countless Jews were murdered during this period. It wasn't until the Maccabean revolt a century or so later that the Jewish people truly felt free again. Jewish leaders came to power and religious practices had returned to normal for a while. A century or so after that, Rome came in and another cycle of oppression started all over again. All of this history was fresh on the minds of the people living at the time of Jesus. And I don't just mean the Jews. Romans knew quite well about the Jewish revolts of the past, and they took bold measures to prevent them from happening again. As praetor, it is Quintus's job to help maintain that order, to make sure to keep the people of his region in line. And for a long time, he did that until Jesus came along. And what Quintus sees is that in a region filled with religious zealots, surrounded by a culture who has a history of rebellion, now there is suddenly a new religious leader on the scene who is drawing massive crowds. He has a zealot as a disciple, and he is compromising Quintus's own soldiers. You see, over the last few seasons, Quintus's lead centurion has become more and more tolerant of Jesus and more rebellious against Quintus. In the show, Gaius holds the position of primi ordines, and what this is referring to is a specific post with a specific division of a Roman military unit. You see, within the Roman military, the standard fighting unit was something called a cohort, and a cohort was comprised of 6 centuries, and each of these centuries was led by a centurion. Now, these centurions differed in ranks. The most senior of these centurions was called the pilus prior, and then there were 5 lesser ranks below that. But here's where Gaius comes into things. You see, just as there was an order to centurions, where some were ranked higher than others, there was also an order to the cohorts. The first cohort was superior to all the other cohorts, and because of this, all of the centurions in that first cohort were superior to the centurions of all the other cohorts. And collectively, they were given the name primi ordines, essentially the first order. So within the cohort, they were the highest ranking centurions, which means that among centurions, Gaius was very high ranking. He had risen up to be among the most elite in his cohort. He wields incredible power and influence over the soldiers who come below him. And now, he's being insubordinate towards Quintus. It is this that sends Quintus's anger to the boiling point. In a region where he needs to maintain military control over this rebellious population, a region where rebellion is certainly brewing, his chief soldier, a man who holds incredible influence over all of Quintus's military units, is refusing to obey his commands, allowing rebellion to grow, and by all appearances, it's all because of Jesus. In a flash, Quintus can see all of his prospects disappearing, the career that he's worked for, the promotions he's dreamed of, and all of it is crumbling around him. And in his mind, it's all Jesus' fault. As far as he can tell, Jesus is the very threat he's been fearing, a captivating leader who is going to assemble the Jews for a revolt, and the exact kind of leader that the religious leaders are hoping for. And what we see in episode 3 of season 4 is how all of these things come together in one tragic moment. The people's needs for a sign, the blindness of the religious leaders, the fears of Rome combine to form a powder keg moment where all of these groups are gathered at the point of combustion. None can truly see what even the blind man knew, what is so obvious before them. Their Messiah is here. Salvation is at hand. But rather than choosing salvation, they each choose the sinful desires of their own hearts. And in the words of Paul, the wages of sin is death. As Jesus watches Zebedee crush olives in episode 4, he isn't crying because it's a beautiful moment, or even just because of his recent heated exchange with his disciples. He's weeping because all of this is pointing to something much bigger, a turning point in the Gospels. You see, olives were a critical part of life in Israel. They were used as food and in religious life, and the process of producing olive oil was especially important in the Gospels. After olives had been picked, they would be crushed with a stone. Olives would be placed in a basin, and a large stone would be pushed around in a circle to break open the olives and begin to draw forth the oil. And then after that, the olives would be taken to a press. This was a series of large stones used to press down onto the olives and draw forth even more of the oil. The oil would be collected in basins and placed in clay jars. In fact, olives would be pressed 3 times in order to draw forth all of the oil. And as Jesus watches this process unfold, he can't contain his emotion because Jesus realizes that these olives represent him. You see, throughout Scripture, after Jesus goes to Caesarea Philippi, his ministry begins to take a dark turn. He turns his face to Jerusalem, and his path of suffering begins. As Jesus looks at these olives, he realizes that just as they are crushed, he too will be crushed. Jesus' last moments will be spent in a place called Gethsemane. In Hebrew, geth is the word for olive, and semene is the word for press. Gethsemane isn't just an olive grove, it's where the olives are pressed. And as Jesus spends his final hours with his disciples that night, he is pressed upon constantly. Just as olives are pressed 3 times, Jesus goes off to pray 3 times, feeling the pressure upon him. In fact, Luke tells us that just as the oil runs forth from the olives, Jesus' heart was much troubled, and he prayed all the more. Water ran from his face like blood and fell to the ground. You see, in Israel, kings were anointed with oil as part of their coronation, but here, Jesus is anointed in his suffering, soon to be crowned with thorns, sacrificed for all. And throughout it all, he is so alone. You see, as Jesus looks at this press, he isn't just broken because of the suffering ahead of him. He's mourning the fact that he will be doing all of this alone, that his disciples can't drink from the cup that he will drink, suffer the pain that he will suffer. They don't get it yet. When he suffers in the garden, they will fall asleep. When he's taken away as a prisoner, they will run. And the realization of this path that lies before him is agonizing. Well, that's it for this episode of The Chosen Explained. Now, if you haven't done it yet, be sure to click the link above and down in the description and download my free resource called 7 Biblical Secrets Hidden in The Chosen. And if you'd like to see even more videos breaking down episodes of The Chosen, then just click this link right here. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.